In this exercise, we're going to be discussing constraints, specifically inference and persistent constraints. We've touched on this briefly, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail because mastering the sketching environment is really about mastering constraints. And we've seen that when we start drawing a line, Inventor will automatically start adding constraints. We've also seen that Inventor will try to give us a temporary constraint, so to speak. We've seen how we can right-click and say, Show All Constraints, and see what it has added for us automatically. And we've seen how to manually toggle these on and off and add them. But it's really important to understand the difference between inference and persistent constraints. In Inventor, we have the option of actually inferring constraints without keeping that constraint. If I were to start drawing, I get these constraints, and I can hold down Control and not keep them. But what if I want it to be perpendicular or parallel, but I just don't want it to remember that? Underneath the Constraint tab, I have the option to toggle on and off constraint persistence. What that means is whenever I come in here and draw, and I see that it's parallel, or that I see that it's perpendicular, and I get done, and I go to F8, Show All Constraints, those constraints are not there. Even though that it drew a parallel or perpendicular line, it did not keep that constraint. When you get into very complex sketching and you want to be able to add flexibility to your sketches, then it's important to not have these completely locked down. For most new users, I highly encourage you to lock everything down whenever possible, but there are going to be times when you need to toggle this on and off. If you get into an environment when you're constantly toggling between persistent constraints and inferred constraints, you can right-click on the command for constraint persistence and say Move to Main Panel. And the same with inference. And there's one more that, if you use this a lot, I suggest you move all three of them at once. You have the space anyways, and it's persistent dimensions. What this means is if I draw this over again, and I have constraint persistence turned on, whenever I hit F8 and I say Show All Constraints, you can see I have my parallel and perpendicular. You can see this one even grabbed this line over here. If I turn off constraint inference, it automatically turns off persistence. Why? Because that's basically Inventor's way of guessing what you're doing. That's the artificial intelligence where it's trying to guess what constraint you would want to use. If it doesn't even try to guess, there's no way for it to keep it. So if inference is on, but persistence is not, that means you get the constraint, but it doesn't keep it. If both are on, you get the constraint, and it will save that constraint. The third option that we have is persistent dimensions. Currently with this on, if I type in a number and I hit enter, you can see that it automatically gave me a dimension, and this means that it's going to drive the sketch and tell it what to do. If I turned off persistent dimension, what this would allow me to do is type in a number and get that distance without locking it down. So in a situation where you may want to get a rough estimate of a distance into a sketch, turn off the persistent dimension and be able to get the rough size in there without locking yourself down with that dimension. For instance, I may want to come back later on, even though I wanted this to be 1 inch to start with, and tell it that this really needs to be the dimension down here, 1.75, minus 0.75. Either way, I get 1 inch, but if this ever changes, if I don't manually put this dimension in and tell it to reference this dimension, there'd be no way of it knowing. With that being said, if there is an existing dimension there, I can take and use that dimension. So if I do dimension display here, as I start sketching, I can say that D0 minus 0.5 is what the dimension should be. The reason I may not want to keep this as I sketch this out is because I may actually want to reference a dimension that is created later on. So if I have dimension 5 that I want this line to be referenced to, and dimension 5 doesn't exist yet, I can't type in d5 minus 0.5. So what I would do is I would sketch it out completely, I would add all the dimensions, and then I'd come back and add this dimension after I added the driving dimension. But at the same time, I may want to give it a rough estimate of what size it is, and that's where persistent dimensions come in. So remember, inference is kind of like O-snaps in AutoCAD, and then persistence is whether or not it remembers that parametrically. Now, just like O-snaps in AutoCAD, for those of you who are familiar with that program, you have the option of turning on some or all of those constraints. If I right-click and I come down to Constraint Options, I will actually get this dialog that asks me what constraints I want to leave on or what constraints I want to leave off. In AutoCAD, in the past, if you had all your constraints on when you were running OSNAP, AutoCAD would just go crazy and it would be very hard for the program to tell what you were trying to snap to. Inventor is much better at this. If you need to temporarily turn this off by holding down Control, that's one of the better ways of doing it. If there is something that gets in your way a lot, you can come in here and toggle one of these off. I suggest that you leave all of these on most of the time because Inventor will figure it out for us. That's where when we get into sketching, we can tell it what line we're talking about. If I clean the plate here, and I start sketching, and I determine that Inventor's not using the line I want to use to reference, I can just come up and rub on it. We discussed this in an earlier lesson. You can see it remembers which one I was talking about. That's fine. I can say, no, I want it to be this line. Or no, I want it to be this line. And Inventor will actually change the focus. So there's not really a reason to turn off my constraints I want it to automatically apply, other than if I want to globally turn them off, manually place them later. For the most part, new users, I suggest you leave all three of these on all the time. And then whenever you're sketching, if you're running into issues, hold down Control to temporarily turn off constraint, inference, and persistence. The persistent dimensioning, I suggest that if you're typing in a number when you're drawing out a sketch, then that number is important enough that you need it to be in there. If it's not important enough to drive the sketch, then don't put the dimension in there to start with. Just eyeball it out, get it close, and then go back add the dimensional constraint later on. Remember that keeping it simple and reducing constraints whenever possible is the best way to create a sketch in Inventor. If you over-constrain it, it will get messy later on whenever you have flexibility or adaptivity turned on in other sketches.